believe it or not, hitting is actually considered age appropriate for toddlers. But you might be clicking onto this video having heard that, having done all the gentle parenting stuff, but still feeling like the hitting is overwhelming and it's actually just interfering with so much of your daily life. So if that's you, I have been there, and I'm sharing today some of the practices that I put in place with my family that really supported not just fixing a behavior, but really looking at the underlying developmental stuff that supports our children. So if we haven't met before, my name is Holly. I am a pediatric occupational therapist. I am a mum, and I'm also the founder of Playful Pod, which is my play and child development membership community. So first off, let's look at what we can really expect from our young children around controlling their impulses, and specifically around hitting. We know that until age 5, and for some children, for example, highly sensitive children, this may be even later, up till age 9, that their ability to actually control their impulses, so that ability to pause before you act, it's just not there. It's not something that your child is choosing to do. It's actually just not there. Now, what that means is that we do, as parents, have the responsibility, if our child is deeply in a hitting stage, that we have that responsibility that we need to be close, because we are going to be needing to physically stop them, or to physically be a barrier, because our job is to keep our children and those around our children safe. But this also gives us kind of a light at the end of the tunnel, that we know that if they are following a normal trajectory for development, that they should get to the point that they are able to control their own impulses. And what we can do right now is really lay good foundation so that they're not just controlling their impulses because they've felt shamed, but they're actually controlling them because they value relationship, because they take responsibility for their actions. Now, this might sound like really big for your 3-year-old who keeps hitting their cousin, but this is what we're really aiming for in the long run. The one thing that I wanted to also dive into before we go into these 4 tips is really understanding hitting in terms of different approaches. So what I hear a lot from families is where did they learn this behavior? Well, they must have seen someone do it, and that's why they do it. Now, this is a difficult kind of rope to follow, because if we presume that any impulse-driven behavior from our young children, which is age-appropriate and typical, is because they've seen it done by someone else, it can really put us in quite an isolated bubble, right? Because you're like, oh, I don't want to go to somebody else's house because their child hits, or their child says potty words, or that we're trying to avoid these behaviors. From my experience with children, yes, if they've seen something happen, they are likely to test it out maybe a couple of times, but it doesn't necessarily mean just because a child has seen someone else hit that they're going to be a hitter for life, right? That the other child has broken them. I find that generally children, and possibly adults as well, we have a go-to strategy that we fall onto when the underlying stuff or the way to support our feelings is not there. So for many children, that will be hitting. That doesn't mean that the children that choose hitting are any better, worse, anything than any other children, because most children have something, right? They are choosing to either hit, or they're choosing to whine or cry or whatever it would be. This is the way that they're expressing the frustration or the lack of impulse control that they have. So hitting is just one of those, and I would really shy away from this idea that is just something that is learned. It also doesn't really help us, right? Because we can't oh, they saw one child hit once, now we can't ever undo this thing of hitting. So what we're looking at today is 4 points that we really look more holistically about what is going on for children, and if some of their other basic needs are not being met, and that is causing this overflow of their choice expression of frustration or emotions, which is hitting. But you might be listening and yours isn't hitting. Your child is a shrieker, and I've had one of those too. And that's just the thing that's coming out. So this video will also help you just kind of address some of these underlying things, or at the very least, get curious about them. So let's really get right in. And the first point is one that, if you know me, if you've been in this community for a while, you have heard me say, and it is about movement. When my child was in their really strong hitting phase, what I really tried to reflect on is how much movement they were getting in their day. You see, when we move our bodies, we are activating different sensory systems. Our proprioceptive sensory system, which gives us feedback to our muscles and joints, and tells us where our body is in space, as well as our vestibular sense, which is in your inner ear, and it's like your sense of movement. So when we are not allowing our children the recommended amount of movement during their day, what can happen is that they need those senses, right? The proprioceptive and vestibular sense, they both work not only in terms of development and like helping us function, but they are also what we call like release valves for our nervous system. So movement is not just about gross motor skills, it's also very, very much about building regulation in our children. And when children aren't moving enough, they may seek out that movement more or use it more as like a go-to strategy when they are frustrated. Because when you knock, here's my now cold coffee cup, when you knock this coffee cup, what's inside will spill out, right? So if there is a need for more movement, it's going to be spilling out, and you may see like an increase or a flare up of that kind of hitting behaviors. So this means that we want to have our children moving. The recommended amount is 3 hours a day, but moving a lot and moving in different ways, spinning, rolling, being able to jump and really feel where their body is, but just allowing that they are getting that basic need, because it is a basic need for children, of movement can be very, very helpful in preventing hitting. The second one is power. Now, I know when we talk about like children having power, for many of us, especially depending on your cultural background, your like jaw kind of drops, because this is the opposite of what we think children need. But actually, especially with toddlers, psychologically they are moving into a stage where they are looking to be autonomous. So power is really important. If you think about children, they actually are pretty disempowered little group of people, because we tell them a lot, we're instructing them a lot, and a lot of the time that instruction can feel like they're being told no or don't, or being very kind of contained. So I'm not saying like give your children the keys to the house and let them run the show, not at all. That's going to do the opposite of helping. But find places or pockets of time that you can really give your child more space. This might be in one-on-one time where they are choosing what to do. You're not instructing, you're not telling them how to play the game right or wrong. You're saying, what do you want to do? You want to do puppets that just drop on the floor? We're going to do that. Like, you're really following their lead in that play. I find, especially as children aged like around 2.5, you can be using dramatic play a lot more. So this is things where they become the teacher and you become the student, or we do this a lot with reading, where they get to be the one that's like reading the book, and especially if they know the books off by heart already at that age, like then they really can. But you're giving them the sense that they are autonomous, that they are important, and that they have a sense of power. This also can be in the small things, like allowing them to help you when you are cooking, giving them more independence when they are dressing. Like in every single pocket of time as you're watching your child function, think about if you can switch roles a bit and give them a little bit more of a sense of autonomy. That again just decreases the amount of frustration that might be bubbling over when you knock that coffee cup. So the next one is overstimulation. I think this is something, now the first two examples that we talked about were really based around our child themselves, like things that can build them up more so that they're not using hitting as that technique as much. The next two that we're going to be talking about are more around the environment, things that we can change to really support them through this phase. And I really do think that hitting, as we've said, it is something that our children will grow out of, but often it's like it comes in waves or in phases. So this might not be something that you feel that you have to commit to for the rest of your life, although many of these things, as you learn to like give your child more autonomy, that just flows more naturally into the flow of your home, and it's good overall. But I know sometimes when we're hearing about different ideas, we can feel like, oh, I can't commit to that for like the rest of my life doing this. So I want you just take this big pinch of salt that this is for a season to really support them through that hitting. And while we're there, I do want you just to give me a comment down below on what are the things that you've already tried. Because as I said, for me, we had tried a lot of gentle parenting techniques, really like changing no's into yeses, holding their hands and physically stopping them, but yesing their emotions, meaning like allowing their emotions and not shaming them for having emotions or frustration. We tried so many of these strategies, and they did seem to help, and I think these are great strategies to have in place and to be practicing regularly for the long run with our children, but it didn't seem to stop the hitting. So that brings us really to our next point, which is about overstimulation. I think we really, really underestimate how different it feels for our toddlers to be in the world and experiencing the world compared to us, because we have fully developed brains, we have fully developed sensory systems, and our kids are in many, many ways still learning. So for us, we were finding that there was like one situation where our child was hitting much more, and it was in a social situation, of course, because this is how it works, right? And it got to the point that it was no longer about like the hitting or whatever, but it felt like it was something that we were doing a weekly meetup. After we were at that meetup, and I felt like I was like a bodyguard to my child not being able to hit everyone. Although it's not that it necessarily happened that he was hitting somebody every single minute, but it just felt like I had to be so on guard that it was no longer enjoyable at all to be there. But also it felt like it took another day afterwards to kind of get back to like a connected, normal flowing relationship that I had with my child, because that time was so incredibly stressful for me, and I know that stress was also projected on him. So when we really like broke down why was this happening in this place? And as a therapist, I work with children around their sensory needs. So I'm pretty in tuned to knowing what's going on for children according to their sensory buckets. But what I just want to like leave you with here is that when our children have slight sensory sensitivities, it may be very hard for us to decode these things. That's why it is great to start at this age getting really, really curious about what's going on for them, why in certain situations they may be acting out more. And you may say like, oh, well, I've tried this, but it doesn't, like nothing seems to fit. And that's really the cue that this is about overstimulation, because it's not something that we'll be able to say like, oh, he touched sand and then he like was so upset and he hit someone. It'll be like that gradual build up of they seemed slightly sensitive when they went inside and there was lots of noise. Then after they were singing, they were a little bit more riled up. And then when this happened, they're a little bit more riled up. And then it got to the point where they either were hitting, or you just could like sense with your intuition that things were about to like start unraveling. Curious about what it feels like for them within those environments, and if it is possible that they are overstimulated. If a child is overstimulated, or they are hungry or tired or whatever it is, it's our responsibility as a parent to know that we need to change that environment, right? Either it means that we need to be leaving that place earlier, we need to be maybe not putting as many commitments into our child's daily schedule, just thinking about how we can really be with them in that time. And again, this is not necessarily something like, for us, it felt like really difficult to kind of make a choice that we wouldn't be going to these weekly meetings, and just because our child was struggling with hitting. But again, if you can get more curious about it and realize that maybe this is just a season that you're going to have to miss out on something, or change something around, move something from the evenings into the mornings, be a little bit more flexible. Maybe if it's something that's happening around the dinner table, specifically when you're with groups or with family, like maybe be a little bit more flexible around what is acceptable at that time or for that specific age group. It can really, really help. Now, overstimulation, as I said, also falls with any of those like basic needs for your child. So if you know that your child is too tired or too hungry or overstimulated, like this is, you now have to know that they cannot manage that behavior by themselves, because their basic needs are needing to be cared for first, right? So this might mean this thing of like leaving early. Maybe you really want to have play dates, but the play dates can only last at that time for 15 minutes. And as your child can build up their like tolerance to that kind of stimulation, then you can have them more. Now, the last tip really feeds into this, and the reason that I wanted to bring this one up specifically is that often we fall into these stories with our children. Like maybe they've hit someone and we've made like a big fiasco about it, and now they're like replaying it every time they're in that situation. Or maybe it's just something that we've fallen into a pattern of every time we go to this place, there's something happening. And it could also be with a certain person. Like a lot of the feedback that you all sent and questions that you had was around specifics, like a child hitting their brother, or a child hitting a cousin, or a child hitting a specific friend that they meet with, or a specific person in daycare. And as a little caveat here, daycare is like kind of a whole other topic in itself, because you aren't there, so our strategies are a little bit different. But the idea that I want to bring here is that if you've fallen into like this kind of what feels like a repeating pattern, break the pattern. So this might be if it's like a play date that you do every week with the same person and it's always becoming an issue, take that play date outside. Like do it completely differently. Like switch out the amount of toys that are there, switch out the way that you're involving your child. And this might need to happen 2 or 3 times to just kind of break the pattern of behavior that was your child was falling into. And again, you don't have to feel like, okay, well, I'm also with a baby and I have the toddler and the toddler's hitting and it's so impossible. You can try 2 or 3 meetings where you are asking your friend or the other mom to hold the baby for a little bit so you can be like more hands-on. Maybe again, you're, instead of meeting at somebody's house, you're going to the zoo, or you're doing something differently, or you have like some kind of game that is like really central and doesn't require too much turn taking or sharing. Just bringing in a bit of change in the way that the environment is structured, so we can decrease our child's frustrations a little bit and kind of allow them to move past anything of hitting. Now, if you feel like none of these are working, like they don't feel like a good fit, you've tried them and you've tried gentle parenting and responsive parenting, and you're still kind of stuck with this, I want to just encourage you to kind of check in with your intuition about what you feel like is going on for your child. There's a very high chance that you really have that answer within you and that you understand your child much more than anyone else. But if you are feeling like you need some extra support, a great place to start may be your pediatrician. They may be able to make some recommendations for you, as well as a play therapist or an occupational therapist, depending on where you feel like the hitting is coming from. If it's something situational, or if it's something that is more based in like sensory processing or movement processing. So that kind of is our summary of hitting. I hope that this was helpful for you. And many of you that wrote to me, you mentioned specifically that this is happening with your 3-year-olds. And I did want to let you know that next week's video is all about 3-year-olds. So make sure to come and check that out.